Oh, hello guys, it's Jenny again. So today I want to talk about the reduction to Hamiltonian cycle um, using three-step. So this is definitely a non-trivial reduction and it takes a lot of time to digest, but don't worry about it too much because we probably won't ask this kind of hard questions like in an exam. So you don't have to come up with this fancy construction yourself during an exam. Um, so I'll talk through the construction in detail and give some reasoning behind like the construction. And also I will prove that it is indeed an NP-complete question. And I hope I can provide some insight regarding how you should think about NP-complete questions. And the slides have very detailed reasoning because I got some external help from another great TA, Sanjit. I highly recommend you to go to his office hour, and I definitely learned a lot last semester by just talking to him. So yeah, if you don't have time, watch the whole video, which is probably gonna take like 20 minutes or something. I encourage you to just read through the slides. And I hope this is gonna be helpful. Uh, yeah. So let's quickly prove that this thing is actually in NP. So the certificate would just be an ordered list of vertices. And the verifier, you just check if there are any duplicated vertices, and then check all the consecutive pairs, whether they're joined by some edges that actually belongs to the graph. I won't actually analyze the runtime here, but please do so in the exam or actual like problem sets. But just trust me, it's in polynomial time. Okay. Before I actually get into like the NP stuff, uh, before I get into like the NP reduction, I'll just have some like general tips about NP complete questions. So by now you should be able to use all those NP complete questions when you're approving new NP complete questions. The first thing that is very helpful is independent set, which is helpful when some question is like when they're including more stuff is harder and harder to do so. Because if you think about this, it's kind of trivial if you only include one node or like zero node because of course it's gonna be independent. So when including more is harder, you should think about independent set. And sort of the opposite of independent set is vertex cover and set cover, which is saying include less is harder. Because if you include every node in the graph, like trivially you're gonna cover every vertex. So yeah, this case is like the opposite. Then you have the Hamiltonian cycle, which is useful for sequencing problems, and subset sum, which is helpful for numerical problems. But be careful using subset sum because sometimes you may get into those pseudo-polynomial time reduction, just as one of the homework questions. And also it's super easy to make backward reduction when using subset sum because like the connection are just like too strong that you just sort of naturally go into the other direction. So be careful when you're actually using the subset sum. And lastly, you can have set and reset. If nothing above works, you sort of have to use set and reset. Okay, now we're going to talk about reduce reset to the Hamiltonian cycle. Reset is just like a special instance of set, which means all the clauses have exactly three literals within. The input and is still pretty much the same with set. You have like a bunch of here you have n variables and you got their negations as literals and also m clauses. So this is one example of an instance of three set, which apparently each clause has three literals. And yes instance for three set is if some assignment of variables can satisfy this formula, then it's an yes instance, which is exactly the same as set. Okay, and then for Hamiltonian cycle, you got an input of directed graph, G. And if it is an yes instance of Hamiltonian cycle, if it contains some cycle such that it visits all the vertex exactly once, and it forms a cycle. So like this thing here, you can see it starts from here, goes to this, and then come back. This is kind of like a toy example of a yes instance of Hamiltonian cycle. Okay, now we're at the first part of the reduction. So the first part is just to transfer the variables into the graph. Let me get okay. It's just to transfer the variables into the graph because like if you think about the variables, in each variable can either be assigned to true or false. which is saying we have 2 to the n independent assignments. And we sort of want to have the same freedom here in the reduction graph, meaning we sort of want 2 distinct possible cycles in this form. And this is how we do it, right? Basically we're saying if you go from left to right, it means x is true, and if you go the other way, you mean x is false. And you connect those two end nodes so that to make sure like the choice of the previous variable is independent from the next variable. That way you can just go whichever way you want to. Also, you have this S and T node just to make sure you can form a complete cycle here, and then you can always get back from T to S. And also each P just corresponds to one variable. And we will see how many nodes inside all those intermediate nodes. We will see how many of those nodes we need. But actually this construction is like the first part, which means it's not enough. And you may ask why. Because I got some students in my office hour asking, oh, why would we even include all those like nodes for classes? So the short answer is, if you think about this construction right now, there's actually completely no constraints. So like all the variables, whatever you take, they all form a Hamiltonian cycle, because you can just traverse everything, like no matter which way you take. So to make this idea more formal, we're saying that the no instance of 3 set are actually mapped to yes instance of the Hamiltonian cycle, which is not good. So we need to add more stuff, like when we're actually reducing. I don't think it's possible, or like maybe for some super smart people, but like it's not that like easy to come up with this construction. At least I cannot come up with it. So but next time if you encounter some problems that require reduction from 3 set or like set to some other problems that include graphs, I think it's kind of a good idea to start here and then see how you can build up some construction from here. Like for example, the homework question just shares a similar taste where you have 2 passes for each variable, and then one corresponds to true and the other corresponds to false. Okay, now we're trying to see how we can actually enforce all those conditions so that we can make sure the no instance map to no. So just as I said, by the design, all variables nodes just can be reached no matter what assignment you have. But some assignment will not satisfy the clauses. So we don't like want them to form valid Hamiltonian cycles. We want to eliminate such cycles. And which is the same idea, yes, pretty much the same. And then if the input 3-set formula is unsatisfiable, then it means that there is no valid assignment ever. So we want to eliminate all those cycles in the graph to secure such node-to-node mapping. And in order to do this, we're saying we add nodes for each class. And notice when we're adding more nodes into the graph, we actually make the problem harder, because by the definition of the Hamiltonian cycle, they have to reach all the nodes. So yeah, this is kind of, we use the clauses to add more constraints to the original question. So here we add m new nodes, which we have one for each class, and each node can be included in the pass if its clause is made true by the assignment. And a Hamiltonian cycle must include all m nodes just by definition. So basically what it's saying is like, if the assignment can satisfy this particular clause, then we should make this node reachable. And since it has to reach all nodes, we're saying that we want a construction that will reflect what clauses we satisfied in the original 3-set problem. And this last point will come up in the construction later. So in the first part of the reduction, the edges and nodes sort of just stay in their own passes. But like now we're adding more edges. So there's nothing stop you from jumping around the variables, which gonna make the proof really messy. So we'll talk about how to avoid this situation later in detail. Okay, so then the question is, how do we enforce such a single clause? Suppose we have a clause here, x1 or x2 or x3. It's pretty easy to see the only thing that's gonna fail is like you have all three variables assigned to false, which is basically saying you can traverse however you want to, unless like everything goes from right to left, which is this case here. So how do we add edges so that when we're traversing everything from right to left, it doesn't allow you to include the node for this particular clause? And okay, so the idea is that we add edges with some particular rule, and the main idea is to encourage traversing in the way that will satisfy the clause. So basically there are two cases here, right? If in the clause you have the form x, like this x1 here, then this clause is true if x is true. And by our construction, we're saying, oh, then we traverse from left to right. And the other case is just this x2 here. Is in the form of x bar, so this clause is true if we assign this thing false. And by false, we mean we traverse from right to left. So to see how we enforce the condition, if okay. By the way, you might ask like, oh, but in the lecture we have like 3 nodes for each class. But then now why we're only using 2? We will use all 3 of them, but don't worry about it right now. We'll talk about it in the next slide. But if we look at the first case here, we want to make the class node reachable if this thing is assigned to true, which means we go from left to right, right? So if we go from left to right, then it means we reach this left node here. I guess for now, the 2 nodes correspond to this clause, and then the same position, like all those 6 nodes all like are just designed for this clause 1. And if we go from left to right, then it means we reach this left node first. And we want it to be reachable. So we add an edge from this left node to the clause. And of course, we have to come back. So then we come back, connect it back to the right node, because we can't really like duplicate the nodes we use. And then you can see sort of in the opposite way, if we're traversing from right to left for x2 here, we want this thing to be reachable if x2 is assigned false. So if it's in this case, then we reach the right node first. Then we connect the right node to clause 1, and then we jump back using the left clause. Then the total number of nodes that we need for one path is actually 3m plus 3, where the m is the number of clauses. But yeah, just as I said, we only use 2 nodes here, but we will see why we need a third node here. Okay, so the third part of the reduction is I draw this like hidden nodes here. This is sort of a dummy node, but you may ask, why 3 nodes for each clause? I think this is the most confusing part. Like, I definitely wouldn't think about this if I'm doing this thing. But the short answer is that by adding this new dummy node, we avoid the possibility of jumping around different variables, which will make the proof simpler. So by jumping around, I mean, like, okay, so I think it's natural to think about, oh, if you go to the clause, then you come back, right? But if you sort of say, oh, if I take this path and I go to clause 1, there's actually nothing stop you from going to this path, which you actually jumped all those nodes here. But it's still possible that potentially there's some clause 2, and then you can just jump back and then go back to path 1. You don't know, but it's so messy to argue. But since this action node here is sort of uniquely tagged by this particular clause and variable, it's like if you know the clause and you know the variable, you know for sure it's this like a dummy node. So if we ever get out of the variable path to reach some clause node outside of the graph, like this graph, we're forced to come back, because otherwise this node will just never be reached. It's not connected to anything else other than like those few nodes in the past. So by adding this new dummy node, we kind of saying, oh, you have to come back. So then we don't have to argue the case where we jump around and then using different clauses. It just makes the proof much simpler. Okay, finally we can talk about the proof. So by now I'm pretty sure everyone is already familiar with this if and only if proof style. So we will talk about the first direction here. And We want to show that suppose there exists some satisfying assignment to this reset instance, then there must exist some Hamiltonian cycle in the reduction graph. And so being a yes instance in Hamiltonian cycle only require one valid cycle in the graph. So basically all we have to do here is to give an explicit construction of a valid cycle according to the truth assignment of the original formula. So here's how we do it. We claim that the following is a valid cycle. If x is true, it means then we traverse the pi from left to right and vice versa. And also while traversing, if the cross node is already reached, then you just continue and do nothing. Otherwise, if you can reach the cross node, then go for it. And we will talk about why this thing is actually a valid Hamiltonian cycle. So firstly, notice how all nodes along the PIs will be traversed. This is sort of given. So since as long as you're on the path, you sort of naturally go along everything. And also then you have to make sure all the cross nodes are covered. So by our construction, the cross node is reachable if at least one of the literals is evaluated to true. Which if you want to satisfy this condition, it means that this clause has to be satisfied. And by our assumption, since we're given a yes instance of 3 set, it means that all the clauses are satisfied. Hence, we can make sure we cover all the clause nodes by our assumption and also by our construction. And lastly, you have to make sure node S and T are reachable, and you can always come back from T to S to form a complete cycle. And this is sort of just also similar to the first part. It's sort of just given, and it is by our design. So this part is pretty straightforward. Now we can talk about the second direction. So I think the text will prove that if there exists some yes instance of the Hamiltonian path, then there exists a yes instance of the 3-set problem. But I think it's easier to prove the counterpositive, which means if the 3-set is unsatisfiable, then there exists no Hamiltonian cycle in this graph. So to do this, we have to assume that any Hamiltonian cycle is in this form, which means you start from S, you go down and then take whatever left and right you want to, and then you keep moving until you get to T and then go back to S, which is sort of the lemma here. But the thing is, of course, you can leave the path when you're like trying to traverse to some of the cross nodes, but eventually you have to get back on the track because we have like those clever dummy nodes here. So the reason that we have to prove this actual lemma here is that being a no instance of 3-set or Hamiltonian cycle is a pretty strong statement, because you're basically saying for the 3-set, there's no ever like 2 to the n assignment that can satisfy this formula. And also for the Hamiltonian cycle, you're saying that all possible passes in this graph like can never be a Hamiltonian cycle. So therefore, although like intuitively we know in order to be any valid Hamiltonian cycle in this like special graph, you have to follow this form. You can't really assume it because like there could be some random valid cycle hiding in the graph. So of course so back to the point is like you have to prove this lemma instead of just assuming it. So you will see we use the dummy node to prove this lemma in the next slide. We didn't like put a complete proof. It's just like a sketch, but I think it should be enough to argue it. But the idea is pretty much what we talked before. It's like, because that thing is uniquely tagged, if you ever like jump to other variables, you're sort of like guaranteed you're disqualified because you missed that dummy node. Okay, so if we assume that the Hamiltonian cycle is in this form, then we can reason about the truth assignments. So because this formula we're given is a no instance of 3-set, which means it is unsatisfiable, then there must exist some clauses that all literals are evaluated to false, regardless of what assignment you choose. This is just by definition of 3-set. So by construction, when variables evaluate to false, they traverse in the direction that cannot reach the class node. So to see why is the case here, we can go back to this case. Say if I assign x1 to false, then it won't make this clause be satisfied. So it means when we're traversing along P1, we do from right to left. So we will reach this node first. But because we're working with directed edges here, sort of the only choice you can move on from this node to the next is to go along this path instead of going to reach the cross node, because there's only like one forward edge here. So this is sort of what we're saying. If you assign this in a wrong way, then you cannot reach the cross node. And so in other words, the clause sort of missed all three of its chances to be reached or satisfied. Hence, there is no possible Hamiltonian cycle in the graph, because we sort of tested all the 2 to the n assignments, and also it has to be in this form, so we don't have to worry about the other stuff. So there's one thing I have to say is you have to keep in mind that if you're proving like not the contrapositive of this statement, so basically saying if you're trying to prove the yes instance of Hamiltonian cycle mapped to the yes instance of 3 set, you still have to prove this lemma, because the reason here is similar. Like you cannot assume the input format of the Hamiltonian cycle you are given unless you prove it has to be in this form. So to see why this is true, consider this thing. So being a yes instance in Hamiltonian cycle only requires that there exist some valid cycles, but it doesn't require the cycle has to be in this form. Hence, you cannot assume that. So this is a really subtle point here, but you have to be careful when you're putting the other direction, like what you can actually assume and what you cannot assume. Okay, this is like a proof sketch for the lemma we just claimed. Again, credit to Sanjit, who really made effort to make the proof super concrete. But the idea is basically what we just said. You have to come back. So I won't go into detail of the proof, but feel free to read through it. So again, we probably won't ask something this tricky on the exam. And also Hamiltonian cycle is already proven to be NP complete. So now you can use this for any sequential. Now you can use this for any sequential questions. But I just hope that everyone can take some time to appreciate the beauty of this construction and think about what similarity shares between this construction and the construction you did in the homework question. Think about how in both questions we mimicked the 2 to the n independent choices and how we enforced the different constraints according to the different question. So I hope this video helps clarify the Hamiltonian cycle reduction, and good luck to the prelim.